The wind had a voice and 1,000 sharp teeth. It was the first thing Mary Calhoun had learned about this new, raw world on the banks of the Powder River. For 4 weeks, it had been her constant companion, a ceaseless whisper that scoured the golden plains and tore at the frayed edges of her soul. It was a Dakota wind, born in the vast emptiness to the north, and it carried the coming winter on its breath. It found every tear in her thin yellow dress, the one with the little blue flowers that now seemed like a memory from another woman's life. The fabric, once crisp and cheerful, was a ragged flag of surrender, clinging to her gaunt frame. Beneath the worn wool blanket she had been given, her daughter Emma stirred, a tiny, restless weight against her chest, 5 months old, and all she had ever known was the gentle sway of a cradle, the smell of her father's pipe smoke, and now this endless rocking of a captured mother, the strange cadence of a foreign tongue, and the gnawing emptiness in her small belly. Mary shifted, trying to offer what little comfort she could, her movements stiff with exhaustion. The hunger was a hollow ache inside her, but it was the thirst that was truly terrifying. Not her own, but Emma's. Her milk, once plentiful, was a betrayal, a slow retreat that left her feeling like a drying riverbed. Each whimper from her child was a judgment. She risked a glance over the edge of the blanket. The Lakota camp was a city of hide and smoke, teeming with a life that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. It moved with a rhythm she was slowly, unwillingly, learning. In the mornings, the air was thick with the scent of cook fires and roasting meat. Women, their hands skilled and sure, worked buffalo hides stretched on wooden frames, their scraping tools moving in a steady, percussive beat. Long strips of meat hung drying on racks, turning a deep, rich crimson in the pale autumn sun. Children, their laughter as sharp and clear as bird song, chased each other through the maze of teepees, their dark hair flying, their bare feet seeming to know every dip and stone in the hard-packed earth. They were gloriously, carelessly alive. Mary was the opposite. She was a ghost, a silent fixture on the edge of this vibrant world, confined to a small, borrowed teepee near the perimeter of the camp. She was a thing to be glanced at, whispered about, and mostly ignored. She understood their caution, their suspicion. She was the enemy, or at least, she was what was left of the enemy after the shouting and the chaos and the terrible, final silence of that day 4 weeks ago. Her husband, John, had been a good man, a strong man, and now he was a memory that flickered and died in the brutal Dakota wind. She could not afford to grieve him, not properly. Grief was a luxury, and all she had was the raw, animal instinct to keep her child alive. So she sat, and she watched, and she listened. She learned the sound of the horses returning at dusk, a soft thunder that shook the ground. She learned the sight of the hunters, proud and blood-streaked, and the quiet, efficient way the women would descend upon the kill, wasting nothing. At night, a drum would sometimes begin its steady, hypnotic pulse, a heartbeat for the entire camp, and songs would rise and fall like the wind itself. It was a life, whole and complete, and she was an intruder, a piece of driftwood washed up on the shore of their existence. A figure moved through the center of the camp, and as always, a hush seemed to follow him. This was the man they called their chief, Chanupa. He was older, perhaps 45 years, with a stillness about him that was more commanding than any shout. His face was a map of his life, weathered by sun and wind, and etched with a fine, silvery scar that ran from the corner of his eye down his cheekbone. It did not make him look fierce, only weary, as if he had seen too much. An eagle feather was tied in his long, dark hair, and it bobbed gently with his measured stride. He walked with the weight of his people on his shoulders, and Mary, who knew something of carrying unbearable burdens, could see it in the way he held his head. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark and deep, and in them swam a sorrow so profound it seemed a permanent part of him. It was a grief that recognized her own. He never looked directly at her teepee, He never acknowledged her presence, but she felt his awareness of her, a silent, constant pressure. He was the one who had stopped the angry shouts of the younger warriors that first day. He was the one who had gestured for this teepee to be given to her. He was the one who decided if she and Emma would see another sunrise. His silence was her lifeline and her sentence, and she did not know which way he would finally lean. Emma began to fuss again, her tiny fists balling against Mary's collarbone. The familiar panic tightened its cold grip around Mary's heart. She unlaced the top of her dress with trembling fingers, her skin chilled by the ever-present wind. "Hush now, little bird," she murmured, her voice a dry rasp. "Hush now." She guided Emma to her breast, praying for something, anything, to be there. The baby latched on with a desperate suckling, but after a moment, she pulled away, her cry growing louder, angrier. It was a cry of frustration, of pure, unmet need. "Please," Mary whispered, tears welling in her eyes and freezing on her lashes. "Please, just a little." She rocked the wailing infant, her own body a hollow drum of failure. She pressed her forehead against Emma's soft hair, inhaling the sweet, milky scent that was fading day by day. "You just drink, sweet girl," she whispered, the words a desperate incantation against the wind. "As long as I am breathing, you will eat." Her baby's cries were a beacon. They drew eyes. From across the camp, a woman looked up from the hide she was scraping. Her name was Joaquinella. Mary did not know her name, but she knew her face. She knew the hatred in her eyes. It was a clean, sharp hatred, not born of malice, but of a pain that mirrored Mary's own. Joaquinella had also lost her family. Mary had gathered from gestures and tones, a husband and a child taken by the world Mary represented. Every time Joaquinella looked at her, Mary felt as though she were staring at her own executioner. Joaquinella's gaze was a physical blow, a constant reminder that her presence here was a wound, an infection in the body of the tribe. Today, the look was sharper than ever, intensified by Emma's cries of hunger. It was a look that said, "Your suffering is a poison here." The fear was a living thing, coiling in her gut. The rumors were another. She could not understand the words, but she understood the dark looks, the gestures toward the east, the way the men cleaned their rifles with a grim intensity. The white soldiers, the cavalry. They were coming. She had heard the name of the river, Powder River, spoken like a curse and a battle cry. She knew what that meant. She and Emma were caught in the middle, a spark that could ignite a prairie fire. She was a liability, a reason for an army to descend upon this camp, a reason for more death. She was a bad omen. Two young boys, no older than 10, were chasing a stray dog near her teepee. One of them, bolder than the other, slowed and pointed a chin in her direction. His friend stopped, his eyes wide. The first boy grinned, a flash of white teeth in a dirt-smudged face. "Do not look at that teepee," he said in the Lakota tongue, his voice pitched in a dramatic whisper that carried on the wind. "The wind spirits will bite your tongue." They both giggled and ran off, their game resuming as if nothing had happened. But the words lingered. The wind spirits. That is what she was to them. Something unnatural, something to be feared. A ghost already. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and her crying child, trying to make them both disappear. She closed her eyes and focused on the single, desperate prayer that had become the rhythm of her heart. "Let my daughter live. Let my daughter live. Let my daughter live." She did not know how long she sat there, lost in that desperate loop of fear and hope. The sun had moved across the sky, and the shadows of the teepees grew long and sharp, like dark fingers reaching across the land. The sounds of the camp began to change, the busy work of the day giving way to the softer sounds of the evening. The drum had started its low, steady beat in the distance, and through it all, Emma cried, a thin, desolate sound that the wind seemed to mock, carrying it away and scattering it over the vast, indifferent prairie. Mary had nothing left to give her. She was empty, and in that emptiness, a cold, clear certainty began to form. They would not survive the night. The teepee was a cage of hide and shadow, and the only sounds were the relentless whining of the wind outside and the fading, pitiful cries of her daughter. Mary held Emma close, her own body a cold, useless vessel. The last vestiges of hope had dried up with her milk. She rocked, a slow, mechanical motion that offered no comfort. Her mind a blank slate of despair. This was how it ended, not in a flash of violence, but in a slow, quiet fade into the Dakota dust. Emma's cries softened into weak, breathy whimpers, the sound of a flame guttering out. Each tiny gasp was a nail in the coffin of Mary's heart. Then the light changed. The pale oblong opening of the teepee, her one window to the world, went dark. A shadow fell across the threshold, a massive, human-shaped eclipse that blotted out the afternoon sun. Mary froze, her rocking motion ceasing. Her breath caught in her throat, a painful, sharp knot. This was it, the moment she had been dreading and, in a strange, exhausted way, anticipating for 4 long weeks. They had tired of the crying. They had decided the ghost in their camp had lingered long enough. She clutched Emma so tightly the baby let out a small, startled squeak. It was a futile gesture, the last instinct of a mother animal shielding her young from the inevitable. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the teepee flap to be thrown aside, waiting for the heavy footstep, waiting for the final, swift motion that would end their suffering. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was worse than any shout. The only sounds were the blood pounding in her ears and the ceaseless moan of the wind. She could feel the presence in the doorway, a solid wall of quiet authority. She did not need to open her eyes to know who it was. It was the chief, Chanupa. He was the beginning and the end of her fate in this place. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips, a soft surrender. Slowly, she forced her eyes to open. He stood just outside the entrance, his tall frame filling the space. He did not enter, but his gaze penetrated the gloom of the small teepee, finding her where she huddled on the dusty buffalo robe. His face was unreadable, the lines carved by time and sorrow giving nothing away. The silver scar on his cheek seemed to catch the faint light. He looked at her, then at the tiny, whimpering bundle in her arms. Mary met his gaze, her own eyes pleading, exhausted, and finally, resigned. She had nothing left to offer. Not defiance, not strength, not even a proper plea. There was only the stark, simple fact of a dying child and her helpless mother. For a timeless moment, he simply watched. He seemed to be listening not to Emma's cries, but to something deeper, the silent, desperate rhythm of Mary's terror. He was not looking at an enemy. He was looking at a woman unraveling at the seams. Then, he turned his head slightly and spoke. His voice was low and calm, the words in his own tongue, and they were not directed at her. A moment later, a slighter figure appeared at his side. It was a girl, perhaps 17 or 18 years of age, with wide, curious eyes and long braids that hung over her shoulders. She looked from the chief to Mary with a mixture of fear and fascination. Chanupa spoke to the girl again, a quiet, firm command. The girl nodded and disappeared, her footsteps light and quick. Chanupa remained in the doorway, a silent, unmoving sentinel. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. What was happening? Was this some ritual? Was the girl fetching the weapon that would end it? The uncertainty was a fresh form of torture. Emma began to fuss again, her tiny body trembling with a new wave of hunger and cold. The girl returned as silently as she had left. In her hands, she carried a small, tightly woven basket and a water skin. Chanupa gestured with his chin toward Mary. The girl, whose name was Zitkala, hesitated at the threshold, her eyes darting nervously toward Mary as if she might bite. She took a deep breath and crept inside, her moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. She knelt a respectful distance away and pushed the offerings toward Mary. Mary stared. The water skin was dark and damp with condensation. The basket held a small mound of pemmican, the rich, life-giving mixture of dried meat and fat, and a handful of shriveled, dark red berries. It was food. It was water. It was life. A sob caught in Mary's throat, so powerful it was completely silent. She looked from the basket to the girl, and then to the impassive chief still framed in the doorway. The girl, Zitkala, pointed to the water, then to Emma. She spoke a few halting words in English, her voice soft and shy. He says, "For baby." She then pushed the basket closer. "For you." Mary could not move. Her limbs felt as though they were made of lead. It did not make sense. This kindness was more disorienting than any threat. It shattered the neat, terrifying world she had constructed in her mind. Zitkala, seeing her paralysis, gently took the water skin and unstoppered it. She poured a small amount of water into her own cupped hand and held it out toward Emma's lips. The baby, sensing the moisture, turned her head and began to weakly lick at the water. It was the most beautiful sight Mary had ever seen. The spell broke. With a shaking hand, Mary took the water skin. She let a few drops fall onto her finger and touched it to Emma's mouth. Her daughter drank. Mary took a small sip herself, the cool liquid a shock to her dry throat, a blessing that seemed to spread through her entire body. Then she broke off a tiny piece of the pemmican and put it in her own mouth, chewing it slowly, letting the rich oils coat her tongue. Strength, immediate and real, flowed into her. Chanupa spoke again in Lakota. Zitkala listened, then turned back to Mary, her expression serious. He says, "You are under his watch," she translated, the words clearly costing her effort. "No one harms you. You, safe." Safe. The word was so foreign, so impossible, that it had no meaning. But the water was real, the food was real, the quiet authority in the chief's gaze was real. He had not come to punish her. He had come to save them. He held her gaze for one moment longer, a look that was not of pity, but of a deep, solemn understanding. Then he turned and walked away, his shadow releasing the teepee, letting the sunlight spill back in. The act had not gone unnoticed. An entire camp had been holding its breath, and now it exhaled in a collective wave of shock and speculation. The news moved faster than a prairie fire, a current of whispers and wide-eyed glances. By a communal fire pit, two young warriors who had been sharpening their arrows stopped their work. One stared at the teepee, then back at his friend, his mouth agape. He spoke, his voice loud enough to carry, full of a dazed, momentous wonder. The Lakota chief found a captive woman nursing an infant in his camp. What he did shocked the entire tribe. His friend could only shake his head, staring into the flames as if searching for an answer. The words, spoken aloud, took on the weight of a legend being born. They were repeated from teepee to teepee, a story gaining power with each telling. It was an aberration, a break in the known laws of war and survival. It was an act that defied explanation. Nearby, an old woman with skin like wrinkled leather sat mending a moccasin. She heard the young warrior's pronouncement and let out a dry, crackling sound that might have been a laugh. She looked up, her eyes small and bright with the wisdom of many winters. Shocked, she rasped, her voice like stones grinding together. The human heart is the most unpredictable country of all. But not all hearts were moved to wonder. Wakanela had watched the entire scene from the entrance of her own teepee. The hatred in her eyes had curdled into a cold, furious rage. This was not just an act of compassion. It was an act of betrayal. She strode from her lodge, her back straight, her jaw set, and walked directly into the center of the camp, placing herself in Chanupa's path as he returned to his own lodge. Several people stopped to watch. This was a direct challenge. "You shame us," Wakanela said, her voice low but vibrating with fury. "You shame the memory of our dead." Chanupa stopped, his face calm. He did not raise his voice. There is no shame in seeing a child is hungry. That is no child of ours, Wakanela shot back, her voice rising. It is the spawn of our enemy. Every mouthful of food you give them is stolen from the mouths of our own children. Your pity is a weakness. Chanupa, this foolish compassion will be the death of us all. When the soldiers come looking for her, will your kindness shield our warriors from their bullets? A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the raw emotion in her voice. Her pain was their pain. Her fear was their fear. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the onlookers. She was speaking a truth they all understood. Before Chanupa could reply, another woman stepped forward. She was older than Wakanela, her hair streaked with gray, her movements slow and deliberate. Her name was Winona, an elder who had been captured from the Crow as a young girl and had since become one of the most respected women in the tribe. Her face was serene, but her eyes held an authority that no warrior would dare question. She placed a gentle hand on Wakanela's tense arm. The spirits do not give us children to watch them starve, no matter whose blood they carry, Winona said, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the anger. She looked from Wakanela to the faces in the crowd, and then to Chanupa. A sharp blade is a good thing in a fight, but wisdom does not always carry a sword. Wakanela fell silent. Though her eyes still burned, the crowd, caught between the fire of her grief and the deep water of Winona's wisdom, began to disperse, returning to their tasks. The conflict had been laid bare. It was not settled, merely postponed. Back in her teepee, Mary knew nothing of the debate raging outside. She only knew the feeling of Emma, finally quiet, suckling weakly but steadily at her breast. She knew the taste of water and the solid, reassuring weight of food in her stomach. The wind still howled, a lonely song of winter coming, but for the first time in a month, she felt the smallest, most fragile flicker of a different rhythm. It was the slow, steady beat of her own heart, no longer a frantic drum of terror, but a quiet, hopeful promise of another sunrise. The chief's act of kindness was a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples continued to spread, altering the very fabric of Mary's existence. Survival was no longer a matter of hoarding the last drops of her own failing strength, but of navigating the complex currents of a world that had, for a moment, offered her a lifeline. The food and water continued to arrive, delivered silently by the young woman, Zitkala, who had become Mary's sole link to the human race. For several days, this was the new rhythm. Zitkala would appear with sustenance, her eyes wide with a curiosity that was slowly overpowering her fear. Mary, her strength returning, would nod her thanks, a gesture that felt woefully inadequate. It was Zitkala who began to build the bridge. One afternoon, she set down a bowl of warm corn mush and pointed to it. She said a word, her voice soft, Wagmisa. She repeated it, looking expectantly at Mary. Mary, understanding, pointed to the bowl and echoed the word, her pronunciation clumsy. A slow smile spread across Zitkala's face. She then pointed to the water skin. Mni. Mary repeated the word. Mni. This became their ritual. With each delivery of food, a new word was offered. Talo for meat, Wopila for thanks. The vocabulary was small, a handful of smooth stones in the palm of her hand. But it was a beginning. It was the difference between being an animal in a cage and a person in a room. Zitkala also taught her the language of silence and movement. She demonstrated how the women of the camp walked, with small, deliberate steps, their eyes downcast when passing the men's lodges. It was a lesson in making oneself small, in being unobtrusive, a lesson Mary, who felt like a giant, clumsy intruder, took deeply to heart. One day, Zitkala arrived not with food, but with a strange and beautiful object. It was a cradle board, a wooden frame intricately decorated with dyed porcupine quills, its hide pouch soft and supple. With careful gestures, she showed Mary how to swaddle Emma and secure her safely in the carrier. The first time Mary settled the cradle board onto her back, the sense of liberation was overwhelming. Her arms were free. Emma, snug and secure against her spine, seemed to enjoy the gentle, rhythmic sway as Mary paced the confines of her teepee. For the first time in months, Mary felt a flicker of her old self, a woman who could work and move, not just a creature pinned down by the constant, desperate need of her child. The cradle board was a passport. It allowed her to step outside the teepee, to walk with Emma through the camp without the vulnerability of carrying her in her arms. She still drew stares, but now they were mixed with something else. The cradle board was their way, and seeing her use it seemed to soften the edges of their suspicion. Her tentative steps into the life of the camp led her to a new threshold. One morning, the elder Winona appeared at her teepee, accompanied by another woman who shared her serene features, but carried herself with the air of a tireless worker. This was Tatawin, Winona's sister. Her hands were strong and calloused, her gaze direct and appraising. She looked at Mary, then at the tidy stack of empty food bowls in the corner, and gave a single, decisive nod. Through Winona's patient translation, an offer was made. Mary was to move into Tatawin's teepee, not as a guest, but as a helper. The move was a blur of fear and gratitude. Tatawin's teepee was larger than her own, and it was a workshop, a home, and a kitchen all in one. The air inside was thick with the smells of smoked leather, sage, and the herbs that hung in dried bunches from the lodge poles. Buffalo robes were piled high, and tools for scraping, cutting, and sewing were neatly arranged. It was a place of purpose, and Mary knew she was expected to find her own. Tatawin was a master of hides, a woman whose skill was respected throughout the tribe. She was also a patient, if silent, teacher. Her first lesson for Mary was the most grueling. She led her to a freshly skinned buffalo hide stretched taut on a large wooden frame. She handed Mary a tool made from bone, its edge worn smooth with use, and demonstrated the motion, a steady, downward scrape that separated the last bits of flesh and fat from the skin. It was brutal, back-breaking work. Mary's hands, accustomed to needlepoint and kneading dough, were soft and useless. Within an hour, they were raw by the end of the day. Angry red blisters had risen on her palms and fingers. The muscles in her back and shoulders screamed with a fiery protest. She worked until she was dizzy with exhaustion, her movements clumsy and inefficient next to Tatawin's fluid expertise. She collapsed onto her sleeping robe that night, every inch of her body aching, feeling a shame deeper than the physical pain. She was weak. She was useless. She awoke to find Tatawin kneeling beside her. The older woman held a small stone bowl containing a green, fragrant paste. Without a word, she took Mary's hands in her own and gently, methodically, began to apply the cool salve to each blister. The relief was immediate, a soothing balm that seemed to leach the fire from her skin. Tatawin did not offer words of comfort, but her touch was its own language. It was a language of practical care, an acknowledgement of the effort, a promise of healing. Mary had earned her first lesson. Life fell into a new, demanding rhythm. Days were spent at the stretching frames, scraping until her arms felt like lead. She learned to smoke the hides, to pound dried meat and berries into pemmican, to cook corn mush over the central fire. She was always tired, always sore, but with each passing day, she felt a change within herself. The hollow shell of the grieving widow was being filled, packed tight with the simple, solid reality of hard labor. She was earning her keep. She was contributing. Zaitkala still came, her visits a bright spot in the long days. During a break from her work, Mary sat with her, pointing to objects and stumbling through the new words. She pointed to her cup, asking for the word for water. Mni, Zitkala supplied patiently. A moment later, a handsome pony was led past the teepee entrance. Wanting to learn its name, Mary pointed and confidently said, Mni. Zitkala's eyes widened, and then she covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. She finally let out a peal of musical laughter that drew the attention of Tatooine, who looked over with a rare, small smile. "What did you say?" Zitkala asked, her English slow but her amusement clear. "I asked for the name of the horse," Mary said, confused. Zitkala shook her head, still giggling. "You did not ask for horse. You asked, 'Do you want to drink a horse?'" Mary's face flushed with embarrassment, but then she started to laugh too. A real, genuine laugh that felt like a rusty gate creaking open. It was a shared moment of simple, human absurdity, and it felt like sunshine. The true thaw, however, came from Emma. As she grew stronger, she became more aware of the world around her. One afternoon, Mary sat just outside the teepee, Emma on her lap, enjoying a rare moment of rest. A group of small children were playing nearby, their game a boisterous mix of chasing and shouting. One of them, a little girl with bright, curious eyes, grew bold and toddled closer, staring at Emma's pale skin and light brown hair. She reached out a hesitant finger to touch Emma's cheek. In a flash, Emma's tiny hand shot out and grabbed a fistful of the little girl's dark hair, pulling hard. The girl let out a surprised yelp, more startled than hurt. For a tense moment, all the children stopped their game and stared. Mary's heart leaped into her throat, but instead of anger or tears, the little girl's face broke into a wide, toothy grin. The other children, seeing the comical sight of the tiny white baby holding their friend captive by the hair, burst into a collective shriek of laughter. The ice did not just crack, it shattered. From that day on, the children no longer saw Emma as an object of suspicion. She was just another baby, one who, like them, could be mischievous and unpredictable. They would come to peer at her, offering her smooth stones and brightly colored leaves, their initial fear forgotten. But while the children's acceptance was a balm to Mary's spirit, she knew that not everyone in the camp shared their innocent outlook. The acceptance of Tatooine and Winona, and the tolerance of Chanupa, had not erased the deep-seated resentment held by others. The opposition was quiet, but it was there, a snake coiled in the shadows. One evening, Mary went to the communal water supply to fill their skin for the night. When she returned and began to pour a drink, the water gushed out not from the spout, but from a long, clean slit near the bottom of the bag. It was not a tear from use. It was a deliberate cut. A cold dread washed over her. It was a message. "You do not belong here. You are a drain on our resources." Another time, she carefully laid out strips of jerky on a drying rack, proud of her work. When she returned an hour later, several pieces had been thrown to the ground and deliberately trampled into the dirt. Footprints ground into the precious meat. Shame and fear warred within her. Her presence was causing waste. She was the source of this discord. She never spoke of these incidents to Tatooine. There was no need. The older woman saw everything. When the water skin was cut, Tatooine simply took it, and with a needle and sinew, stitched the gash so neatly it was almost invisible. When the meat was spoiled, she gathered it up without comment and threw it into the fire, her face a mask of stern disapproval not directed at Mary, but at the unseen perpetrator. A new guardian appeared. Tatooine's son, Chiton, was a young warrior, tall and powerfully built, who rarely spoke. He had regarded Mary with the same stoic indifference as the other men, but after the incidents of sabotage, his behavior changed. He began to make it a habit to pass by their section of the camp several times a day. He would walk slowly, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, his dark eyes sweeping over everyone and everything. He never spoke to Mary, never even acknowledged her directly, but his presence was a clear and potent warning. He was a silent sentinel, a line drawn in the dust. "This woman," his posture said, "is under the protection of my family. Harm her at your peril." Mary would watch him from the corner of her eye, a profound and complicated gratitude swelling in her chest. She was still an outsider. She was still the enemy to some, but she was no longer alone. She had a place, however tenuous. She had work, however hard. And she had protectors, however silent, as she scraped away at the tough, unyielding hides, her hands growing calloused and strong. She felt as if she were also scraping away the woman she used to be, revealing someone new and tougher underneath. The Dakota wind still blew, but she was learning how to stand against it. The hard-won piece of routine was a thin blanket against the Dakota wind. For weeks, Mary's world had shrunk to the size of Tatooine's teepee, to the rhythmic scrape of bone on hide, the steady bubbling of the cookpot, and the soft, gurgling laughter of her daughter. Her hands, once blistered and raw, were now tough and capable, her muscles no longer screaming in protest, but humming with the quiet strength of sustained effort. She was learning the language, not just of words, but of work. She understood the precise angle to hold the scraper, the exact moment to turn the meat over the smoke, the subtle shift in the wind that signaled a change in the weather. She was becoming useful, and in that usefulness, she found a fragile shelter for her soul. The small acts of sabotage had ceased, quelled by Chiton's silent, watchful patrols. She was, if not one of them, then at least a fixture, a part of the landscape of the camp, like a solitary tree that had somehow taken root in foreign soil. The change came as it always did in this land, suddenly and without warning. It arrived on the back of a lathered horse, a single rider emerging from the vast, empty prairie to the east. He was one of their own, a scout, but he looked different. He rode not with the easy lope of a returning hunter, but with the desperate, frantic urgency of a man fleeing a ghost. He did not slow as he entered the camp, but rode straight for the large council lodge at its center, his horse's sides heaving, its nostrils flared and red. A silence fell over the camp. The rhythmic scraping stopped. The women looked up from their work, hands frozen in motion. The children's laughter died in their throats. The scout slid from his horse before it had even come to a full stop, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. He staggered toward the council lodge, shouting a name. Chanupa. The name, carried on the wind, was a summons and an alarm. Chanupa emerged from his teepee, his face calm, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing of the scout's exhaustion and fear. Other men began to gather, the elders and the warriors, their faces grim. They disappeared inside the council lodge, the heavy hide flap falling shut, sealing them away with the terrible news the scout had brought. The camp held its breath. The world outside the council lodge became a stage of silent, anxious pantomime. Women gathered in small, whispering groups, their eyes fixed on the closed flap. Chiton appeared at the entrance to Tatooine's teepee, a rifle held loosely in his hand. He said nothing, but his presence was a command. Stay inside. Mary's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. She had felt this before, this sudden, sickening drop in the pit of her stomach, this silence that preceded a storm. She pulled Emma's cradleboard closer, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's chest. Tatooine continued her work, her hands moving with the same steady precision as always. But her shoulders were tense, and she did not hum her usual quiet song. The work was a prayer, a defiance against the unknown terror that had just ridden into their lives. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the jagged line of the western horizon. Finally, the lodge flap was pushed aside, and the men began to file out. Their faces were like stone, set and hard. There was no consensus in their eyes, only a deep, troubled division. Mary watched them disperse, some heading to their lodges to check their weapons, others gathering their families close. The invisible membrane of peace had been torn, and the raw, cold fear of the world was rushing in. Later, as the shadows grew long and the cook fires were lit, Winona came to their teepee. She sat with Tatooine, and they spoke in low, serious tones. Mary, though she could only catch a word here and there, pieced together the horrifying mosaic of the scout's report. It was the cavalry, a patrol of 20 soldiers, moving along the river. They were not just passing through, they were burning camps, small, isolated hunting parties who stood no chance against them. And they were doing it, the scout had said, under the pretense of a noble cause. They were searching for a white woman and child, a mission of rescue that would bring them glory and praise back at the fort. The corn mush turned to ash in Mary's mouth. It was her. She was the ghost the soldiers were hunting. She was the righteous cause that was leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. Every family left homeless, every warrior who fell. Their blood was on her hands. She looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully, her tiny face a perfect portrait of innocence, her daughter. The reason for her every breath was now the reason this entire community was in mortal danger. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate her. The division in the council, Winona explained, was deep. One faction, led by a pragmatic warrior named Stone Bear, had argued for the most direct solution: give the woman back, ride out to meet the soldiers, hand her over, and let them go on their way. It was a matter of survival. He had argued, why should Lakota children be put at risk for a white woman who was their enemy by birth? It was a cold, hard logic. And many of the men, their faces etched with worry for their own families, had nodded in agreement. Another group had argued for flight, pack up the camp, abandon the precious stores of meat they had prepared for the winter, and flee deeper into the wilderness where the soldiers would not follow. Hide the woman, they said, keep her out of sight. It was a strategy of avoidance, a gamble that they could outrun the coming storm, but it meant sacrificing the security of their winter camp, a choice that could lead to starvation when the snows came. Then Chanupa had spoken. Mary leaned forward, straining to understand Winona's careful words. He had listened to both sides, his face impassive, when he finally rose to his feet. A hush had fallen over the lodge. He had looked at the faces of his men, at their fear and their anger, and he had spoken, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the teepee. He had said that to hand the woman over would be to let the soldiers dictate their laws. It would be an admission that the cavalry's authority was greater than their own. It would be an act of fear, not of strength. To run, he had continued, was also to let fear make their decisions. It was to abandon their home, their ancestral ground, because an enemy had appeared on the horizon. This is not about the white woman, Chanupa had said, his words sinking deep into the hearts of the men. She is the excuse, not the cause. The conflict was here long before she arrived, and it will be here long after. The question is not what we do with her. The question is who we are. Are we a people who hand over the helpless to our enemies to save our own skin? Are we a people who run from our homes at the first sign of trouble, or are we the Lakota? We will not run, and we will not bargain. We will remain in our home, and we will defend it. His decision was final. They would stay. They would post more sentries, keep the horses close, and they would watch. They would be ready. A short while later, Chiton entered the teepee. He gestated to Mary's few belongings, the worn blanket, the extra set of moccasins Tatooine had made for her. He pointed toward the center of the camp. They were moving, without a word. Mary bundled her things while Tatooine carefully lifted Emma's cradleboard. They stepped out into the twilight and walked past rows of teepees, heading for the very heart of the village. A small, unoccupied teepee not far from the central council lodge. The meaning was clear. She was being moved to the most defensible position, a place where she could be protected, but it felt like being moved to the center of a target. With every step, she felt the eyes of the camp on her. She saw the fear in the faces of the women, the grim resolve in the eyes of the men. She saw Wakanela standing outside her teepee, her arms crossed, her expression a cold, bitter confirmation of all her warnings. Mary was the spark, the detonator, and now the entire village was a powder keg, waiting for the match. That night, in the strange, new teepee, she could not sleep. The weight of her guilt was a physical presence in the small space. She listened to the soft breathing of Tadawin and Emma, and the quiet sounds of a camp preparing for war. She thought of the families in the burned-out camps, and her heart ached with a pain that was almost unbearable. She rose and went to Tadawin's side. The older woman's eyes opened in the darkness, as if she had been expecting her. "If I am the danger," Mary whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The Lakota words clumsy but heartfelt. "Let me go. I will take my daughter, and I will walk away. They will find me, and you will be safe." Tadawin looked at her for a long moment, her gaze steady in the faint moonlight that filtered through the smoke hole. She reached out and placed a calloused hand on Mary's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You would not get a mile before the wolves or the cold found you," Tadawin said, her voice a low rumble. "And if the soldiers found you, do you think they would simply thank you and leave this land in peace? Their hunger is for the land, not for you. You are just a convenient reason." She paused, her thumb rubbing a slow circle on Mary's arm. "If you leave," she said, her voice softening slightly, "you only trade this cold wind for another. Here, at least, there is a fire." Mary looked toward the center of the teepee, where the embers of the evening fire glowed with a deep, steady warmth. A fire. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but in that moment, it was everything. Tadawin was right. Out there, in the vast, cold darkness, there was no fire, only the wind. She returned to her robes, the crushing weight of her guilt now mingled with a fierce, burning resolve. If she was to be the cause of this danger, she would not be a helpless liability. She would work until her back broke. She would prove that the life they were risking to save was one worth saving. She would be a credit to their fire. The days that followed were stretched taut as the hides on the drying frames. A heavy, watchful silence settled over the camp, replacing the easy rhythms of work and play. The children's games were quieter, their laughter less frequent, and they stayed closer to the family teepees. The men were a constant, grim presence, their eyes always scanning the horizon, their hands never far from their weapons. Every gust of wind sounded like the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Mary worked with a feverish intensity, her mind a whirlwind of guilt and resolve. She scraped and cleaned and cooked, pushing her body to its limits. As if through sheer physical exhaustion she could atone for the danger she had brought upon these people. She was a debt, and she was determined to repay it with the currency of her own sweat and toil. The arrival of the traders was a welcome disruption, a brief return to a semblance of normalcy. It was not the soldiers. It was a small party of Cheyenne, old allies of this band, accompanied by a man who seemed to belong to two worlds at once. His name was Thomas Bridger. He had the high cheekbones and dark eyes of his mother's people, but his skin was a shade lighter, and his beard was the brown of a white man. He wore buckskins, but his hat was a battered felt bowler, and he spoke the Lakota tongue with a fluid, easy confidence. Yet his English was the unaccented speech of a man raised near the trading posts and forts. He was a bridge between cultures, a man who made his living in the spaces in between. His arrival brought a brief festival of trade. The Lakota women laid out finely quilled moccasins and painted buffalo robes, and Bridger and the Cheyenne offered knives, iron pots, and brightly colored beads. It was a moment of commerce and diplomacy, a reminder of a larger world that was not entirely defined by war. Mary watched from a distance, keeping to the shadows of Tadawin's teepee, a ghost at the feast. She had no interest in the trade, but she watched the trader, Bridger, with a wary curiosity. He was the first white man she had seen since John's death, and the sight of him stirred a complicated mix of feelings she could not name. It was on the second day that he sought her out. Chanupa himself brought him to their teepee, a sign that the visit was officially sanctioned. Tadawin and Winona were present, their faces impassive, their presence a silent circle of protection around Mary. Bridger removed his hat, a gesture of respect from his father's world, and nodded to the women before turning his gaze to Mary. His eyes were kind, and they held a deep, weary understanding of the complexities of this land. "Ma'am," he began, his voice soft, "my name is Thomas Bridger. I trade between the tribes in Fort Laramie. I was told of your situation." Mary simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She held Emma, who was sleeping on her lap, a warm, solid weight that anchored her to the present moment. "I am heading back to the fort in about a month's time, before the heavy snows set in," he continued, getting straight to the point. "I can take you and your daughter with me. I can guarantee your safe passage." The words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown across a vast, churning sea. Fort Laramie, safety, people who looked like her, who spoke her language, an end to this constant, gnawing fear. It was everything she had once prayed for. For a moment, she was dizzy with the possibility. She could see it, a clean room, a proper bed, a world where the cry of a hawk was just a bird and not a potential signal of attack. Bridger seemed to sense her turmoil. He reached into a leather satchel and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "News travels. Ma'am, there are reports of a new military campaign being planned for the spring. A big one. They mean to clear this whole territory. This is not a safe place for you to be. It is going to get worse. Much worse. Before it gets better." A spring campaign. The words confirmed her deepest fears. The soldiers were not just a passing patrol. They were a tide, and it was coming in. Bridger's offer was not just a kindness. It was an escape from a coming apocalypse. He was offering her a door out of a house that was about to be set on fire. She looked at Tatooine, whose face was an unreadable mask, at Winona, whose eyes held a deep, sorrowful wisdom. They would not tell her what to do. This was her choice alone. She looked down at Emma's sleeping face. What was the right path for her daughter to stay here, in the heart of a war zone, surrounded by a love that was fierce and protective, but perhaps not powerful enough to stop a bullet, or to return to a world of supposed safety, where they would be penniless, homeless, and dependent on the charity of strangers? What would that life at the fort be? She would be a curiosity. The captive woman returned from the wilderness. She would be an object of pity, a widow with an infant, entirely reliant on the goodwill of a government that had failed to protect her husband. She would have to tell her story again and again, reliving the horror for the morbid entertainment of others. Emma would grow up a pauper, the child of a tragic story. She would have safety, perhaps. But what kind of life would it be? Here, in this camp, life was brutal and uncertain. But here, Emma was not an object of pity. She was simply a child. She was fussed over by the other women, played with by the children, and protected by the watchful eye of a strong community. Here, a child was the future, a sacred trust. In this world of hide and smoke, Emma had a place. She had a family of sorts, a formidable grandmother in Tatooine, a wise great-aunt in Winona, a silent, watchful uncle in Chiton, and what did Mary have to return to a grave? A handful of memories that were growing dimmer with each passing day. The world she had known was gone, burned away in the raid that had taken her husband. She had no home, no money, no family to speak of. To go back would be to embrace a future as a ghost, haunting the edges of a society that had no place for her. Here, she was slowly, painfully, becoming a person again. Her hands were no longer the soft, useless things of a farmer's wife. They were the calloused, capable hands of a woman who could feed herself, who could contribute, who could endure. She had a purpose. She thought of Chanupa. She thought of his quiet, unexpected act of compassion that had saved their lives. She thought of the honor that had compelled him to risk his entire village rather than bow to an outside threat. He had given her more than just food and shelter. He had given her a chance to reclaim her own dignity. To leave now would be to cheapen that gift, to treat his profound moral stand as a mere convenience, a temporary shelter until a better offer came along. It would be a betrayal of the deepest kind. She took a slow, deep breath, the decision settling in her soul not with a clash of logic, but with a quiet, certain click, like a latch falling into place. She looked up at Thomas Bridger, her gaze clear and steady. "Thank you, Mr. Bridger," she said, her voice stronger than she had expected. "It is a kind offer, a generous one, but we will not be going with you." Bridger's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I do not think you understand the danger." "I understand it perfectly," Mary interrupted gently. "I have nothing to go back to. My husband is gone. My home is gone. That world has nothing for me or my daughter. Here my daughter is safe. Here, she is cared for." She looked at Tadawin, a look of profound gratitude passing between them. "Here, we have a fire." Bridger stared at her, his trader's mind struggling to comprehend a choice that defied all logic and self-preservation. He saw not a captive, but a woman who had chosen her ground. He saw a conviction in her eyes that was as solid and unyielding as the earth beneath them. He slowly put his hat back on his head. "I see," he said, though it was clear he did not fully understand. "I wish you well, ma'am." He gave a final nod to the silent Lakota women and then turned and left the teepee. That night, the camp felt different. The news of her decision had spread as quickly as the news of Bridger's offer. She had chosen them. She had tied her fate to theirs, not as a helpless burden, but as a willing participant in their shared struggle. When she walked through the camp, she saw a new respect in the eyes of the people. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber acceptance. She was no longer just the white woman. She was the woman who stayed. Sleep did not come easily. The weight of her choice was heavy. But it was a good weight, the weight of a commitment made and honored. In the deep quiet of the night, when the moon was high and the camp was asleep, she heard a soft sound outside the teepee. It was the crunch of a moccasin on the dry, cold earth. Her heart seized for a moment, the old fear flaring up, but the footstep was slow, deliberate, and it paced the perimeter of the teepee once, then paused, before moving on. A few minutes later, it came again, a slow, silent patrol, a guardian in the night. She knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that it was Chanupa. He was checking on her. He was making sure the soldiers had not crept close in the darkness. He was standing watch. It was the act of a chief protecting his people, but it felt deeply, intensely personal. The next night, he was there again, this time, as his patrol brought him past the teepee entrance. She was sitting up, unable to sleep. He saw her silhouette in the faint moonlight. He stopped. For a long moment, they were just two figures in the vast, cold darkness, the silence between them filled with unspoken things. He took a step closer, his voice a low rumble, his English careful and deliberate. "Stay," he said. It was not a command, but a statement, a confirmation of her choice. "Winter wind is long." A small, weary smile touched Mary's lips. She looked around the small, circular space of the teepee, her new home, her entire world. "As long as," she replied, her own voice soft, "my feet walking around this teepee." He understood her meaning. His burden was the long, hard winter ahead for his people. Her burden was the small, confined circle of her new life. They were both trapped, in their own ways, by duty and by circumstance. A flicker of understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of their shared endurance. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and then the sound of his footsteps faded into the night, leaving Mary alone with the quiet, steady glow of the embers and the profound, unshakable knowledge that she was home. The days shortened, and the sun's warmth became a distant memory, a pale gold wash on a landscape bleached and hardened by the cold. Mary's decision to stay had altered the air around her. She was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of the camp. She was a choice, a living testament to an allegiance that transcended blood. This new reality required a new definition, a formal recognition that would either solidify her place or shatter the fragile peace she had found. The community, poised on the brink of war, needed unity, and the lingering question of the white woman was a crack in their foundation. Chanupa, a man who understood that symbols were the mortar that held a people together, decided it was time to seal that crack. He announced that a council would be held, not in the private confines of the lodge, but in the open, before the eyes of the entire village. On the appointed day, the air was sharp and still, the sky a vast, unforgiving blue. A large fire was built in the central clearing, its flames a vibrant, dancing defiance against the encroaching winter. The people gathered in a wide, silent circle, their faces serious, their breath misting in the frigid air. Mary stood beside Tadawin and Winona, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Emma was snug in her cradleboard on Tadawin's back, a silent observer to her own fate. When all were assembled, Chanupa stepped into the center of the circle. He wore no special regalia, only the quiet, immense authority of his office. The eagle feather in his hair stirred in the slight breeze. He let the silence settle, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his people, acknowledging their fear, their doubt, and their hope. He began to speak, his voice calm and steady, carrying clearly in the cold, thin air. He spoke of the long winter ahead, of the coming trials. He spoke of the strength of their community, a strength that came not from a single bloodline, but from a shared heart and a shared fire. He reminded them that their own history was filled with stories of people from other tribes, like Winona herself, who had been welcomed and had become pillars of their society. A people, he said, were defined not by who they excluded, but by who they chose to protect. Then, he turned his gaze directly to Mary. The entire circle seemed to lean in, holding its breath. The white woman who came to us in sorrow has chosen to remain with us in danger, he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. She has refused the path back to her own world, a world that has taken everything from her. She has chosen to share our fire, to work with our women, and to raise her daughter among our children. Her heart is not the heart of an enemy. Her hands are the hands of a sister. He beckoned to Tadawin, who led a trembling Mary forward. They stopped before him, in the heart of the circle, bathed in the warmth of the fire. From this day forward, Chanupa announced, his voice rising, she is no longer a captive. She is no longer an outsider. Tadawin, sister of Winona, a woman of great skill and a strong heart, takes this woman as her daughter. She will be a part of her family, and her family is a part of us. A murmur went through the crowd, a mix of surprise and solemn approval. Chanupa raised a hand for silence. A new life requires a new name, he said. He looked at Mary, his eyes holding hers. He saw the strength she had forged in the fire of her grief, her quiet resilience, her refusal to be broken by the winds of fate. We will call her Wayaka Waste, he proclaimed. Good feather. For a good feather is strong but flexible, and it bends in the wind but never breaks. He then gestured to the cradleboard on Tadawin's back, and her daughter, this child of two worlds, will be a child of our own. She will be known as Wichikala Waste. Good little girl. She is our future, and we will protect her as our own. He stepped back, the ceremony complete. Winona came forward and embraced Mary, whispering the new name in her ear like a blessing. Wayaka Waste, one by one. Other women from the circle came forward to touch her arm or nod in welcome. Chiton stood with the warriors, his face unreadable, but a flicker of pride in his eyes was unmistakable. She was now, by law and by ritual, his cousin. Mary, now Wayaka Waste, felt a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to buckle her knees. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of belonging. She was no longer Mary Calhoun, the grieving widow, the lost soul. She was Good Feather, a daughter of Tadawin, a woman of the Lakota. Yet, as she looked out at the circle of new faces, her gaze fell upon a figure standing apart, on the very edge of the gathering, half hidden in the shadow of a teepee. It was Wakanela. Her arms were crossed, her face a mask of cold, unforgiving stone. She had witnessed the entire ceremony, but had remained outside the circle, a silent, powerful dissenter. Her presence was a stark reminder that a name and a ritual could not erase all bitterness, that the community was still a fractured thing, held together by the sheer force of its leader's will. The new identity was a gift, but it was a fragile one, and it would have to be defended. That night, the wind returned with a vengeance. It howled around the teepee, a wild, mournful song that seemed to shake the very poles of the lodge. The celebration had been quiet and sober, and now the camp was hunkered down against the storm, a small island of warmth in a vast, roaring sea of cold. Emma was asleep, and Tatooine was already lost in the deep, untroubled slumber of the righteous. But Mary, Wayaka Waste, could not rest. Her new name felt strange and wonderful on her spirit, a heavy cloak she was not yet used to wearing. She sat by the fire, watching the embers glow, listening to the wind. The flap of the teepee was pushed aside, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought the storm had broken in. But it was Chanupa. He slipped inside as silently as a shadow, letting the flap fall shut behind him, muffling the roar of the wind. In his arms, he carried a heavy, beautifully painted buffalo robe. He said nothing, but walked to her side and draped the thick, warm robe over her shoulders. The hide was soft, and it smelled of sage and wood smoke. It was an act of profound and simple care. He then settled himself on a robe on the other side of the small fire, the space between them charged with a quiet intensity. "The wind speaks of our ancestors tonight," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's fury. He was staring into the fire, but she knew he was speaking to her. "My husband," Mary heard herself say, the words coming out in a whisper. He did not like the wind. He said it sounded too lonely. Chanupa nodded slowly, his eyes dark with memory. "My wife," he said. The word a stone dropped into a deep well of sorrow. She would sing to the wind. She said it was the only way to teach it a happier song. He paused, the silence stretching between them, thick with ghosts. The spotted sickness took her song away, and our sons, the shared confession of their losses, was a bridge built across the fire. They were no longer chief and stranger, Lakota and white. They were simply a man and a woman who had known the deepest kind of pain, the tearing away of a part of their own soul. She told him of John, of his strength and his easy laugh, and of the small farm they had dreamed of building. He spoke of his wife, of the way her hands were never still, always beating or sewing, and of his son, who had been fearless on a horse before he could barely walk. They spoke of the dead not with bitterness, but with a gentle, aching love, giving their memories voice in the sanctuary of the teepee while the storm raged outside. As he spoke, he leaned forward to push a stray log back into the fire. His hand brushed against hers where it rested on the robe between them. The touch was electric, a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a simple, accidental contact, but it held the weight of everything unspoken between them. He did not pull his hand away, and neither did she. He looked up from the fire, his gaze meeting hers. In his eyes, she saw not the stoic chief, but the man, his sorrow laid bare, his loneliness a mirror of her own. He saw her, not as the captive, not as the newly named Wayaka Waste, but as Mary, a woman whose strength he had come to admire, whose spirit he had seen refuse to break. Slowly, he leaned across the firelight, and she leaned toward him. He raised a hand and gently touched her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear she had not realized she had shed. Then, he rested his forehead against hers. The contact was intimate, profound, a silent communion of two souls who had found an anchor in the storm. "We are alive," he whispered. the words a breath of air against her lips. It was a statement of the most fundamental truth, a defiant cry against the ghosts and the grief and the wind. And in that shared, desperate, beautiful truth, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was soft, gentle, and as elemental as the fire that burned between them. It was a promise, not of a future, but of a present, a promise that in the midst of the howling darkness, they were not alone. The moment was perfect, fragile, suspended in time, and then, from the cradleboard nearby, came a soft, gurgling sound, followed by a distinct, disgruntled whimper. Emma was stirring. The spell was broken. They pulled back, a small, shared smile breaking the solemnity of the moment. Chanupa looked over at the cradleboard, a deep, rumbling chuckle in his chest. "This little one," he said, his English slow but his humor clear. "Is she the fire guardian?" Mary laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like a release of all the tension she had held for so long. She looked at her daughter with a fierce, overwhelming love. "She is the highest chief in this house," she replied. The bond was forged, a deep and powerful connection of respect and a budding, tender love. But as Chanupa stood to leave, the reality of their world returned. He was a chief, with the laws to uphold and a people to lead through a coming war. She was his adopted kinswoman, a position that came with its own strict set of rules. The kiss had been a truth, but the path to that truth was still a long and dangerous one, fraught with custom and responsibility. He left as he had come, a shadow slipping back into the storm, leaving her wrapped in the warmth of his robe, with a new name, a new hope, and a heart that was, against all odds, beginning to beat again. The fragile peace born of the ceremony was a fleeting thing, a single warm day before the true arrival of winter. The season did not creep in. It descended like a predator. A great blizzard swept down from the north, a roaring wall of white that swallowed the sky and buried the prairie in a deep, soundless shroud. For days, the world shrank to the interior of the teepee, a small, smoky haven against the screaming fury of the wind. The Powder River, their lifeblood, froze solid, its familiar murmur silenced beneath a thick plate of ice. The carefully gathered piles of firewood dwindled at an alarming rate. Each log burned a countdown to a future of shivering darkness. Nature, in its vast, impersonal power, had become their jailer and their most immediate foe. It was in the heart of this frozen siege that Mary's deepest fear was realized. Wichikala Waste, her good little girl, began to burn with fever. It started as a small fretfulness, a refusal to nurse. But by nightfall, her tiny body was terrifyingly hot to the touch, her breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. Mary's blood ran cold. In her old life, she would have known what to do, would have had remedies of her own. Here, in the heart of a blizzard, surrounded by a knowledge she did not possess, she was helpless once more, the old panic of familiar, choking poison in her throat. She held Emma to her chest, rocking her, whispering prayers that were lost in the howl of the wind. Tatawin watched, her face a mask of concern. She touched the baby's forehead, her lips tightening into a grim line. Without a word, she rose and slipped out of the teepee, disappearing into the blinding white chaos. She returned moments later, half covered in snow, with Winona at her side. The elder came to the fire, her movements calm and deliberate, a small island of peace in Mary's storm of fear. She carried a leather pouch from which she took a handful of dried, crushed leaves. Their scent was sharp and clean, cutting through the smoky air. She instructed Mary to hold the baby close to a pot of steaming water while she sprinkled the herbs onto the surface. A fragrant, medicinal vapor rose, and Winona draped a light hide over Mary and the baby, creating a small tent of healing steam. "Breathe, little one," Winona murmured, her voice a low, hypnotic chant. "Breathe in the strength of the earth." For hours, the three women kept vigil, Winona mixed other herbs into a paste, creating a poultice that she gently spread on the baby's chest. Tatooine kept the fire fed with their precious wood, her presence a solid, unwavering wall of support. She sat beside Mary through the long, dark hours, her hand resting on Mary's back, a silent transfer of strength. There was no sleep. There was only the roar of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the desperate, focused prayer for a tiny life to hold on. Mary watched everything Winona did, her fear sharpening her senses, her mind absorbing every detail. She saw which leaves were used for the steam, which roots were pounded for the poultice. She learned the careful way Winona heated a special flat stone wrapped in hide to warm the baby's feet. She was not just a mother in that moment. She was a student, a desperate apprentice in an ancient school of healing. As the first pale, gray light of dawn filtered through the smoke hole, the fever broke. The baby's skin grew cooler, her breathing deepened, and she began to nurse weakly. The storm outside still raged, but the storm inside Mary's heart had passed. This trial by fire and ice forged a new purpose within her. She began to spend every spare moment with Winona, learning. She learned to identify the different herbs hanging from the lodge poles, their names and their uses. She learned how to prepare tinctures, how to clean and bind a wound with chewed yarrow leaves to stop the bleeding, how to set a simple fracture. Her hands, already tough from scraping hides, learned a new kind of skill, a gentler strength. She was becoming more than useful. She was becoming necessary. Her first true test came unexpectedly. A pair of young hunters, barely men, had been caught on the edge of the camp by a cornered and enraged wild boar. One had escaped with minor cuts, but the other, a boy named Little Hawk, had been gored in the thigh, the tusk tearing a deep, ragged wound. They brought him into the nearest teepee, which happened to be Wakinella's, shouting for a healer. Winona was at the far side of the camp, tending to an elder with a chest cough. People gathered, their faces pale with shock. Little Hawk was bleeding badly, his legs soaked in a terrifying crimson. Wakinella stood frozen, her own memories of loss rendering her helpless in the face of this fresh horror. Mary, hearing the commotion, rushed to the teepee. She saw the wound, the fear in the boy's eyes, the panicked indecision of the others, and a strange calm settled over her. She knelt at the boy's side, her voice clear and firm. "More light," she commanded, and someone hurried to bring a burning brand from a fire, clean cloths and hot water. She worked quickly, her mind a clear reflection of Winona's teachings. She pressed her hands firmly on the wound to slow the bleeding. When the water and cloths arrived, she began to clean the gash with a steady hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. She sent a child running to her own teepee to fetch the pouch of yarrow. When it came, she packed the herb into the wound, and as Winona had taught her, the bleeding began to slow, then stop. She took a clean strip of hide and bound the leg tightly, her knots firm and sure. Throughout the entire ordeal, she was aware of a presence at her shoulder. It was Wakinella. The woman had not moved, but had watched every action, her face a rigid mask. As Mary finished tying the bandage, her hands covered in the boy's blood, she realized she needed one last strip of cloth to secure it. She looked around, but there was none. Wakinella, without a word, turned, took a small, clean buckskin dress from her own belongings, and with a swift motion, tore a long, perfect strip from the hem. She held it out to Mary. Their eyes met over the injured boy. Mary took the strip of hide, her fingers brushing against Wakinella's. In that moment, the years of cold hatred in Wakinella's gaze flickered. It was not replaced by warmth, not yet, but the hard, brittle ice had cracked. She saw not a white woman, not the cause of her pain, but a pair of capable hands that had just saved a boy she had known since his birth. Wakinella gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of undeniable acknowledgement, and then turned and melted back into the shadows of her teepee. The incident solidified Mary's new role. She became Wayaka Waste, the healer. People began to come to her with their injuries, their coughs, their children's fevers. She always consulted with Winona, deferring to her greater wisdom, but more and more, she was trusted to act on her own. One evening, as she was grinding herbs near the fire, Chanupa entered the teepee. He had come to thank her for saving Little Hawk, who was now healing well. The formal gratitude soon gave way to the quiet intimacy that had grown between them. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the flames. "I watch you," he said finally. His voice low. "You have a strong spirit, but I see the sadness that walks with you." He looked at her, his own eyes dark with a familiar sorrow. "When I saw the boy bleeding, when I saw the fear for your own child in the storm, I confess, it brought back my own fear." He looked away, into the fire. "I am afraid of losing people again." The confession was a rare glimpse into the heart of the stoic chief, a moment of profound vulnerability. Mary's heart ached for him, for the burden of loss he carried so silently. She thought of all the promises people make, promises of safety and happiness that are so easily broken by fate. She reached out, not to touch him, but as if to touch the space between them. "I cannot promise you that there will be peace," she said, her voice soft but sure. "The world does not offer such promises. But I can promise you this: I will walk with you through whatever comes." His shoulders seemed to lose some of their tension. He looked at her, a deep, grateful warmth in his eyes that was more intimate than any touch. It was a promise of partnership, a vow of shared endurance. The heavy solemnity of their lives was not without its moments of light. Mary's grasp of the Lakota language was growing, but it was far from perfect. One afternoon, she was trying to prepare a poultice for a warrior's bruised shoulder. She needed a specific type of dried root, a pejuta. She turned to Tatawin, who was mending a moccasin. "Tatawin," she said carefully, "may I have a piece of hogan?" Tatawin looked up, her brow furrowed in confusion. Hogan meant dried fish. She looked from Mary to the bowl of crushed leaves, then back to Mary. She pointed to the bowl, then made a swimming motion with her hand. "You want to put dried fish in the medicine?" she asked, her deep voice rumbling with bewilderment. Mary's face flushed as she realized her mistake. She had mixed up the words. Winona, who was sitting nearby, let out a soft chuckle. "I think, sister," she said to Tatawin, "that our new daughter is trying to make a very unusual kind of stew." Suddenly, Tatawin understood. A slow grin spread across her weathered face, and she let out a rare, booming laugh that shook her entire body. The sound was so unexpected and full of genuine mirth that Mary, after a moment of deep embarrassment, began to laugh too. It was a simple, foolish mistake. But in their shared laughter, the teepee felt more like a home than ever before. She was not just a student or a healer. She was a daughter who could make a clumsy mistake and be met not with judgment, but with the warm, accepting laughter of family. The winter was still long, but the fire inside was growing brighter. The first true day of spring arrived with the sound of a gunshot. It was not the crack of a soldier's rifle, but the deep, resonant boom of the Powder River, as the winter ice finally surrendered to the relentless pressure of the current beneath. For weeks, the Great Freeze had held the world in a state of suspended animation. Now, with a groan that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth, the ice fractured, and great, churning plates of it began to move, grinding against each other as they were swept downstream. The sound was a declaration of freedom, a violent, chaotic birth of a new season. A cautious optimism had begun to thaw the camp along with the river. The brutal cold had receded, and the sun held a genuine, promising warmth. The people emerged from their winter confinement, their faces turned toward the light, a collective sense of relief palpable in the air. The threat of the soldiers had not vanished, but with the impassable snows of winter, it had been a distant one. Now, with the land opening up, A hunting party was sent out, a mission of hope to bring back the first fresh meat after a long season of dried rations and corn mush. Mary, now fully Wayaka waist, watched them go, her heart lifting with a shared sense of promise. The world felt as if it were taking its first full breath after being submerged for too long. The breath caught in the throat of the entire village 3 days later. They did not return as they had left. A proud, laughing group of hunters. They returned in a shattered, silent procession of death. 2 riders, one slumped over his horse's neck, supported by the other, who had a bloody bandage wrapped around his arm. Behind them, 2 riderless horses, upon which were draped the limp, broken bodies of their companions. A third was missing entirely. A wail went up from the women, a single unified cry of grief and horror that seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of the bright spring day. People ran from their teepees, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning terror. Mary's blood ran cold, the familiar, sickening dread returning with the force of a physical blow. She grabbed her medicine pouch by instinct and ran toward the arriving riders, her mind struggling to process the scene. The story came out in ragged, breathless gasps from the wounded survivor. They had been successful in their hunt, tracking a small herd of pronghorn. They were dressing the kill when the soldiers appeared on the ridge. There had been no warning, no challenge, just the sudden, shocking volley of rifle fire. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Thomas Bridger's grim prophecy had come true. The spring campaign had begun. The camp transformed into a cauldron of grief and rage. The bodies were carried to their family lodges, and the low, keening songs of mourning began. A sound that would continue unbroken for days. But beneath the grief, a dangerous, explosive pressure was building. The young warriors, their faces streaked with a mixture of tears and fury, gathered in tight, angry knots. Their talk was of vengeance, of riding out to find the soldiers, of meeting blood with blood. The older men, their faces carved with the memory of past tragedies, spoke in low tones of caution, of the futility of sending their young men to die against the soldiers' superior numbers. The village, once unified against the winter, was now a house divided against itself, and the schism was deep and violent. That evening, Chanupa sent for her. She found him not in the council lodge, but standing alone by the newly freed river, its dark water rushing past, carrying the last remnants of its icy prison. He did not look at her as she approached, his gaze fixed on the powerful, relentless current. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant, heartbreaking sound of the mourning songs. "Wayaka waste," he said, his voice low and heavy, barely audible over the rush of the water. He turned to face her, and in the fading light she could see the profound exhaustion in his eyes, the immense weight of the choice that now rested on his shoulders. "You have seen the hearts of your people. You have lived in their world of forts and laws. Tell me truly, is there a path for us to live together? Is there a peace to be found?" The question was a stone dropped into the deepest part of her soul. He was not asking for a political opinion. He was asking for the truth, for a sliver of hope that he could offer his people. And she knew, with a certainty that felt like a betrayal, that she could not give it to him. She thought of her husband, John, a good man who had wanted nothing more than a small piece of land to call his own. She thought of Thomas Bridger, a man who walked between worlds, trying to build bridges. And then she thought of the soldiers, of the men who gave them their orders, of the maps in their offices that erased the names of the rivers and mountains she was just beginning to learn, replacing them with straight, arbitrary lines. "The desire for peace lives in the hearts of many good people," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But the men who lead your people, the men with the forts and the cannons and the endless appetite for land, they do not see you as people. They see you as an obstacle. They believe this land was given to them by their God, and that it is their destiny to tame it. Individual kindness, a good man's wish for peace. It is like a single drop of rain trying to stop a flood. The flood is not made of men. It is made of an idea, and it will not stop until it has swallowed everything. He listened, his face impassive, but she saw a flicker of profound sorrow in his eyes. She had given him the truth he had asked for, a truth he already knew, but had needed to hear from her lips. It was a truth as cold and hard as the winter they had just survived. He nodded slowly, a gesture of acceptance, not of defeat. He called the council that night. The central fire burned high, casting flickering, distorted shadows on the grim faces of the assembled men. The air was electric with tension. Chanupa let the young warriors speak first, letting them pour out their rage and their thirst for vengeance. Then he let the elders voice their fears, their arguments for caution and survival. When all had been said, he rose to his feet. "I have listened to your words," he began, his voice cutting through the angry murmurs. "I have heard the cry for vengeance, and I have heard the plea for safety. Neither path is the way of the Lakota. To ride out for revenge is to let our anger choose our battlefield, and that is the path of fools. To scatter and run is to let our fear give our homes to our enemies. That is the path of cowards." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We will not be fools, and we will not be cowards. We will not attack their settlements, for we do not make war on women and children. We will not become the monsters we are fighting, but we will not run. This is our home. We will send riders to our cousins, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. We will stand together, and we will defend our families, our children, and our right to exist on this land. We will make our stand here." His words settled over the council with the weight of a final judgment. But as the men began to murmur their assent, a figure stepped forward into the firelight. It was Wakinela. Her face was a mask of pure, undiluted fury, her eyes burning with the fire of her own unhealed grief. "Your honor is a cold blanket for a dead child," she cried, her voice ringing through the silent camp. She pointed a trembling finger at Chanupa. "You speak of defense when our hunters have been murdered like dogs. They have shown us their heart, and it is rotten to the core. We must show them that our spears are sharp, and our hearts are filled with a rage that can match their own. Your compassion for the white woman has made you soft. Chanupa, it has blinded you to the only truth that matters." A tense silence fell. Wakinela's raw, painful words had given voice to the darkest feelings in the camp. Before Chanupa could respond, a calm, clear voice cut through the tension. It was Winona. She had risen from her seat among the elders, her serene face a stark contrast to Wakinela's fury. She looked at Wakinela, her eyes filled not with judgment, but with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "Revenge," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the gathering, "does not feed children." The simple, profound truth of her words landed like a physical blow. The angry murmurs died. The young warriors looked down at their feet. The mothers in the crowd pulled their children closer. In that moment, the argument was over. Winona had reminded them of what was truly at stake, what they were fighting to protect. The silence that followed was as heavy and as solid as a stone wall. The debate was cut short by the frantic drumming of hoofbeats. A scout, posted on the eastern ridge, galloped into the camp, his horse stumbling with exhaustion. He slid to the ground, his eyes wide with alarm. "Soldiers," he gasped. "A large patrol. They are moving fast. They will be here before the moon is high." The camp exploded into a flurry of disciplined, urgent action. There was no panic, only the grim, focused execution of Chanupa's plan. Warriors ran for their weapons, their faces set and determined. Women began to pack essential supplies, their movements swift and efficient. Chanupa stood in the center of the controlled chaos, his voice a calm, commanding presence, directing the warriors to defensive positions in the rocks above the camp, and ordering the women, children, and elders to gather the horse herd and retreat to a sheltered coulee behind the village. Mary did not run for the coulee. She ran for her teepee. Her battlefield was here. She grabbed her pouches of herbs and bandages. She found the older women, her hands moving, her voice clear and steady as she organized them. They would need water, clean hides, moss for dressings. She established a makeshift infirmary in a protected hollow between several large teepees, a place of healing in the heart of the coming violence. The first shots rang out from the ridge, the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the valley. Women screamed, pulling their children close as they ran for the safety of the coulee. Mary saw Wakinela, frozen in place outside her teepee, trying to bundle a few precious belongings, her face a mask of terror. A rifle ball slammed into the main pole of her lodge with a sickening thud. The massive wooden support splintered, and the entire structure began to groan, threatening to collapse. Wakinela looked up, her eyes wide, paralyzed by fear. Without a second thought, Mary ran. She sprinted across the open ground, the air alive with the whistle of bullets. She did not feel the fear. She only saw a life that needed saving. She slammed into Wakinela's side with the force of a charging buffalo, sending them both tumbling to the ground. A moment later, the teepee collapsed in a cloud of dust and splintered wood, right where Wakinela had been standing. Mary pushed herself up, pulling the dazed, coughing woman to her feet, and dragged her toward the relative safety of the hollow, as the full fury of the soldiers' attack descended upon their home. The battle was a sharp, brutal squall that passed as quickly as it had arrived. The Lakota warriors, fighting on their own ground, had used the rocks and ravines to their advantage, their defense fierce and unyielding. The soldiers, accustomed to charging across open plains, were unprepared for the disciplined, determined resistance from an enemy they could barely see. After suffering several casualties and realizing they could not easily overrun the camp, the patrol had retreated, their mission of rescue a bloody and humiliating failure. They left behind a scarred and grieving, but unbroken, village. The silence that followed the last fading gunshot was more profound than the noise of the fight. It was a heavy, ringing silence, filled with the scent of gunpowder and the low, piteous moans of the wounded. The camp was a wreck. Wakinela's teepee was a flattened ruin of hide and splintered poles. Other lodges were pocked with bullet holes, dark, ugly wounds in their painted skins. But the camp stood. The people had survived. Wayaka Waste, her face smudged with dirt and her dress stained with blood, moved through the aftermath like a spirit of calm in the chaos. The fear and adrenaline of the fight had been burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear focus. There was work to do. She moved from one fallen warrior to the next, her hands steady, her voice a low, soothing murmur. She cleaned wounds, packed them with herbs, and bound them with a skill that was now second nature. The women she had organized followed her lead, their faces grim, but their actions efficient, bringing water and clean hides, their presence a silent, powerful web of care. Among the wounded was the young man who had once whispered to his friend about the wind spirits in her teepee. He had fought bravely, but had taken a bullet high in the shoulder. As Mary knelt to tend to him, she saw that his eyes were glassy with fever and pain. He was delirious, his mind lost in the fog of battle and shock. As she gently cleaned the wound, he began to mutter, his words slurred and nonsensical at first. But then a name emerged from the jumble. Wakinela. He reached out a trembling hand, his eyes not seeing Mary, but someone else from his fevered imagination. "I am sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick with a terrible, misplaced guilt. I tried to make her leave. I cut the water skin. I spoiled the meat, for you, to avenge him. But she stayed. And now. His words dissolved into a pained groan as Mary applied a poultice to the wound. Mary froze. The damp cloth held motionless in her hand. The small, cruel acts of sabotage, the incidents she had tried to put behind her, suddenly had a face and a voice. It was this boy. And his motive, laid bare in his delirium, was a twisted, heartbreaking knot of loyalty and grief. He had not acted out of pure malice, but out of a misguided devotion to Wakanela, trying to purge the camp of the woman he believed was a blight on the memory of Wakanela's lost family. He had been trying to win her approval, to be the warrior he thought she wanted him to be. A profound sadness washed over Mary, a sorrow that went deeper than the pain of the battle. She looked at the young man, a boy playing a warrior's game with consequences he could not possibly have understood. He was a victim not just of a soldier's bullet, but of the poison of unresolved grief, a poison that had seeped into the very soil of the camp and had been nurtured by Wakanela's relentless, public bitterness. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the wounded village, Mary was washing the blood from her hands in a wooden bowl. She looked up and saw Wakanela approaching. The woman's face was pale and drawn, her clothes covered in the dust of her collapsed home. She walked with a slow, deliberate gait, her eyes fixed on Mary. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath, watching. Wakanela stopped before her. She did not speak. There were no words for the chasm that had existed between them, a chasm that was now filled with the knowledge of Mary's selfless act and the terrible truth of the young warrior's confession, which had already begun to whisper its way through the camp. Wakanela's gaze fell on Mary's hands, still pink from the water, hands that had saved her life, hands that had tended to the boy her own anger had helped to poison. Slowly, as if lifting a great weight, Wakanela raised her own hand and placed it flat against her heart. She held it there for a long moment, a gesture of profound and silent admission. Then, she reached out and placed that same hand gently on Mary's shoulder. She looked Mary in the eye, and in her gaze, the hard, bitter ice of a long winter finally broke, melting away to reveal a deep, clear pool of sorrow, regret, and a dawning, difficult gratitude. She gave one slow, deep, deliberate nod. It was an apology. It was an act of surrender. It was a peace treaty signed in the silent language of the heart. Mary nodded back, accepting the silent offering, and the long war between them was finally over. The nights that followed were for the living and the dead. The morning songs for the fallen warriors rose and fell with the rhythm of the stars, a constant, sorrowful presence. But there was also a quiet, fierce pride. They had held their ground. They had defended their home. In the midst of this communal grieving and recovery, the bond between Chanupa and Mary deepened, a quiet certainty in a world of chaos. One night he came to her teepee. It was not a secret visit, but an open one. Tadawin saw him coming and, with a knowing look, found a reason to go and sit with her sister Winona. They sat by the fire, the sounds of the morning camp a somber backdrop. The battle had burned away all pretense, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their feelings for each other. "You have the heart of a Lakota woman, Wayaka Waste," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You have earned your name 100 times over." "I only did what anyone would do for their family," she replied softly. He reached across the small fire, not to touch her, but to simply close the space between them. "My heart," he said, the words costing him a great deal, "wishes to call you more than a kinswoman." Mary's own heart ached with a love so powerful it felt like a physical presence in the small teepee. "And mine for you," she whispered. But they both knew the reality of their world. "The laws of our people are strong," he continued, his voice heavy with the weight of his duty. "We are in a time of mourning. My people grieve. A chief cannot take a wife while the spirits of his warriors are still making their journey. The community must heal. The divisions that were revealed, they must be mended. My joy must wait until my people are whole again." She understood completely. His duty was to his people, and it was that very quality, his unwavering commitment to their well-being, that she had fallen in love with. It was not a rejection, but a promise of a future that would be built on a foundation of honor and respect. "I will wait," she said, and her promise was as solid as the earth beneath them. The heavy atmosphere in the camp began to lift in the following days, buoyed by the resilience of the human spirit. The first sign of this was the return of humor, a medicine as powerful as any of Winona's herbs. Chiton, his arm in a sling but his spirit undimmed, was watching as Mary expertly changed the dressing on another warrior's wound. He saw the looks of deep respect on the faces of the men who had once viewed her with suspicion. He caught her eye, and a slow, teasing grin spread across his face. "Wayaka waste," he said, his voice loud enough for several others to hear. "I thought you had already married the whole tribe when they adopted you. I did not realize you were still recruiting." The warriors nearby chuckled, a rusty, unfamiliar sound. Mary looked up at him, a tired but genuine smile touching her lips. The joke was a gift, a sign of her complete and total acceptance. She could be teased like a sister, and she could tease back. "My recruitment standards are very high." "Chiton," she retorted, her voice light and clear. "I am taking applications only from those who know how to change a diaper." A roar of laughter went up from the group, a pure healing sound that seemed to chase away the last of the shadows. A few days later, Mary approached Chanupa as he stood watching the horse herd. She carried a bundle in her arms. She had been working on it for weeks, in stolen moments late at night, a secret project of love and gratitude. It was a fine buckskin shirt, softer than any she had ever felt, and across the shoulders, she had sewn an intricate pattern of beadwork, a design of river and sky, and on the collar she had carefully attached a single, perfect eagle feather. She held it out to him. He took it, his hands tracing the lines of the beadwork, his gaze fixed on the feather. It was more than a shirt. It was a story. It was her story. "A good feather," she said softly, her voice steady in the prairie wind. "Does not break in the wind." He looked at her, and in his eyes was all the love and respect she could ever have hoped for. He did not need to speak. His heart was in his gaze. And so, a new legend was born in the camp. Around the fires at night, the story was no longer a whispered rumor, but a proud retelling. They spoke of the wisdom of their chief, of the day he had made a choice that had shocked them all. They told the story of how the Lakota chief found a captive woman nursing an infant in his camp, and how that single act of compassion had brought them a healer, a hero, and a good feather who had helped them weather the storm. The summer that followed was a season of deliberate healing. The scars on the land and the people began to fade under the warm, steady sun. The collapsed teepee was rebuilt, a communal effort that saw even the children carrying small bundles of new lodge poles. The rhythms of life returned, slower and more thoughtful than before. The alliance with the Cheyenne and Arapaho had been forged in the crucible of shared defense, and frequent visits from their cousins reinforced a new, broader sense of community, a bulwark against the vast and hostile world that lay beyond their valley. The fear was not gone, but it had been transformed into a quiet, watchful resolve. Wayaka Waste, the woman once known as Mary Calhoun, moved through this season of recovery as if she had been born to it. Her role as a healer had become a permanent and respected position, her teepee a place of solace and skilled care. But it was her spirit, her unwavering commitment, that had truly woven her into the fabric of the people. She was no longer a symbol of their division, but of their resilience. As the summer began to bleed into the golden hues of autumn, she took to walking up the low hill that overlooked the camp in the late afternoons. It was a place of peace, where the wind spoke in a softer voice, and the whole of her new world could be seen in a single, sweeping glance. One evening, the light was a thick, syrupy gold, bathing the prairie in a final, glorious warmth before the coming chill. She stood on the crest of the hill, the dry grass whispering around her ankles. Below, the camp was a picture of serene domesticity. The horse herd grazed peacefully on the far side of the river, their coats shining in the slanted light. Thin, straight columns of smoke rose from the smoke holes of the teepees, carrying the scent of roasting meat and burning cottonwood, threads of life stitching the village to the sky. In her arms, she held Wichikala waste. Emma was no longer the fragile infant who had arrived in a bundle of rags in terror. She was a sturdy, laughing toddler, her hair a sunlightened brown, her dark eyes filled with the same bright curiosity as the other Lakota children with whom she played. She babbled in a happy, nonsensical mix of English and the Lakota words she was beginning to learn, her tiny, chubby hands grabbing at the beaded necklace Mary wore. She was a child of two worlds, a living, breathing symbol of a bridge that had been built not with treaties and laws, but with a single, shocking act of compassion. A quiet footstep approached from behind. Mary did not need to turn. She knew the sound of his walk, the steady, measured tread of a man who carried the world on his shoulders but refused to be bowed by it. Chanupa came to stand beside her, but a single, respectful step away. It was not a distance of formality, but of a profound, unspoken understanding. Their love was not a private, stolen thing. It was a deep, quiet river that ran beneath the entire landscape of their lives, a source of strength that belonged not just to them, but to the people they served. They stood in silence for a long time. Watching the life below, they saw Chaitan, his arm now fully healed, teaching a group of young boys how to fletch an arrow. They saw Winona and Tatooine sitting outside their teepee, their hands moving with the easy, practiced grace of a lifetime of work. They even saw Wakinela, her face softer now, the hard lines of bitterness eased, showing a young girl how to properly scrape a hide. The community was healing. It was becoming whole again. This was their justice. It was not the fiery vengeance the young warriors had craved. It was not the cold, territorial victory the soldiers sought. Their justice was in the quiet, stubborn continuation of life. It was in the laughter of a child, the rising of the cook fire smoke, the passing down of knowledge from one generation to the next. The war with the white world could take their land. It could take their warriors. It could break their hearts. But it could not take this. This strength, this identity, was not something that could be conquered. It was something that was woven, day by day, through the shared work of compassionate hands and the stubborn refusal to surrender their own dignity. Mary looked down at the vibrant, teeming life of the camp, a world she had once seen as a terrifying, alien place. Now, it was the only home she knew, the only home she wanted. She had arrived as a victim, a piece of driftwood tossed ashore by a storm of violence. But this community, through its labor and its rituals, through the unexpected kindness of its chief, and the slow, earned acceptance of its people, had given her the tools to rebuild herself. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had chosen to become. Another winter was coming. She could feel its breath in the cooling wind. The alliances would be tested. The soldiers would return, their hunger for this land unsated. The struggle was not over. It would likely never be over in her lifetime. But as she stood on that hill, she felt not fear, but a deep, unshakable peace. They were ready. They had a family, forged in fire and sorrow. They had a shared language, not just of words, but of mutual respect and a common will to survive. They had an identity that was not brittle, but flexible, capable of taking in a stranger and making her a daughter, of taking a child of the enemy and making her their own future. Chanupa finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be a part of the evening itself. He was not looking at her, but at the village below. "The winter will be hard," he said. It was not a warning, but a simple statement of fact. "Yes," she replied, her own voice calm and steady, "but the fire is strong." He turned his head then, and his eyes met hers. In his gaze, she saw the long, hard road ahead, but she also saw the quiet, unwavering promise that they would walk it together. He was her chief, her protector, the man who had seen a human being when everyone else had seen an enemy. And she was his good feather, the woman who had seen the kindness behind his stoic mask, the woman who had chosen his fire over the cold safety of the world she had left behind. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery streaks of orange and purple. A cool breeze swept up the hill, a familiar and constant companion. It tugged at the eagle feather in Chanupa's hair, and it whispered through the soft downy hair of the child in Mary's arms. The wind still blew, and the good feather bowed, but never broke. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment with where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and press the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.